What happens when a man who once slept in his car rises to become one of America's most successful entertainers and then sits across from a host who believes she can bring him down with a few clever insults? What she doesn't realize is that some people have survived far too much to be intimidated by words. What you're about to witness is one of the most satisfying confrontations ever imagined on daytime television. The moment Steve Harvey, a man who built an empire by making millions of people laugh, suddenly turned the tables so completely that his opponent had nowhere left to go. The studio fell silent. The audience held its breath. And then something happened that nobody saw coming. Before we get into this incredible story, make sure you subscribe and share your thoughts in the comments, because trust me, you're going to have something to say about this one. The morning began with the usual energy at the View Studios. Steve Harvey had arrived to promote his latest venture, and everyone expected the interview to be entertaining. After all, Steve had a way of lighting up every room he entered. His natural charisma had helped take him from a struggling stand-up comedian to a media powerhouse, with television shows, best-selling books, and a radio empire reaching millions of listeners. When Steve walked into the studio, he looked every bit the part. He was dressed in one of his signature suits, his famous mustache perfectly groomed, and his trademark smile already putting the production crew at ease before the cameras even started rolling. At 67, Steve had reached a level of success most people could only dream about. Yet somehow, he had never lost the down-to-earth personality that made audiences from all walks of life connect with him. In the green room, his team went over the usual talking points. Steve simply laughed and waved them away. He had been doing interviews for 3 decades. He didn't need a script. He just needed to be himself. That authenticity had gotten him this far. But what nobody expected was that Behar had arrived that morning with a very different agenda. Behind the scenes, according to the story, Joy had reportedly been making dismissive remarks about Steve for weeks. She considered his motivational advice overly simplistic. She disliked the way he talked about relationships. And she believed his folksy, down-home personality was carefully constructed, a polished image designed to appeal to ordinary people. Today, she had apparently decided to challenge that image. She wanted to see what was really underneath it. The studio lights blazed as Steve took his seat at the famous table. He greeted each host warmly, his booming voice instantly filling the room with energy. The audience responded with enthusiastic applause. Many were longtime fans of Family Feud and had come specifically to see Steve in person. Whoopi Goldberg opened the segment with obvious warmth. Our next guest is a man who does it all: television host, comedian, author, radio personality, and, according to my sources, the owner of more suits than any man should legally possess. Please welcome Steve Harvey. The applause was loud and sustained. Steve stood briefly, turning toward the audience with his arms spread wide before showing off his perfectly tailored navy blue suit. "What can I say?" he joked. "A man's got to look good. That's the first rule of success right there." The audience erupted in laughter. This was the Steve Harvey they had come to see. Confident, charming, and effortlessly entertaining. Sarah Haynes asked about his latest project, and Steve immediately launched into an engaging explanation that had the audience listening closely. "You know what I've learned after all these years?" Steve said, leaning back with the relaxed confidence of someone completely comfortable in his own skin. "Success isn't about being the smartest person in the room. It's about being the hardest working. It's about getting back up every time life knocks you down. And believe me, life knocked me down plenty before I finally figured that out." The audience nodded along. His message was simple, but it resonated. For several minutes, everything felt completely normal. Then Behar leaned forward. There was something different in her expression. A familiar glint appeared in her eyes, and almost immediately, the atmosphere inside the studio changed. The other hosts noticed it. The audience noticed it. And then Joy spoke. "So, Steve." Her voice carried an unmistakable edge. The other hosts exchanged uneasy glances. The friendly interview was about to become something very different. You talk a lot about success and hard work, Joy began. But let's be honest. A huge part of your success has come from telling people, especially women, how they should live their lives. Your book, Act Like a Lady, Think Like a Man, was basically a guide telling women how to behave if they wanted to attract a man. Don't you think there's something a little condescending about that? A man standing there telling women what they're doing wrong? The question was clearly designed to put Steve on the defensive. Several people in the audience shifted uncomfortably. But Steve didn't flinch. If anything, his smile became wider. Well, Joy, he replied calmly, that book sold millions of copies. So apparently, quite a few women thought there was something useful in it. The audience chuckled. Steve paused for a moment before adding, "But I understand your concern. It probably is frustrating when someone gives advice that actually connects with people." A few laughs broke out around the studio. "And you've been giving advice on this show for years," Steve continued, "so I imagine it must be especially frustrating when the audience doesn't always follow it." The room erupted. Joy's expression changed for just a second. But she quickly recovered. "That's cute, Steve," she said. "But let's talk about your own relationship history. You've been married 3 times. 3 times." She emphasized the words. "Don't you think it's a little hypocritical for a man who couldn't make 2 marriages work to write books teaching people how to have successful relationships?" Steve slowly nodded. He didn't look angry. He didn't even look surprised. "You're absolutely right, Joy," he said. "I've been married 3 times. You know why?" He leaned slightly toward the table. "Because I kept trying until I got it right." The audience reacted immediately. That's what you do when you're serious about winning. You don't quit because something didn't work the first time. You learn. You grow. You try again. Steve paused. "My 3rd marriage has now lasted for decades." Then he looked directly at Joy. "So let me ask you something. How long did your marriages last?" The studio suddenly went quiet. The question hung in the air. Joy's expression tightened. "We're not talking about me," she said. "We're talking about you." Steve smiled. "Oh, I see." He leaned forward. "So I can be questioned about my personal life, but yours is suddenly off limits?" A few audience members laughed. "That's an interesting standard, Joy. Is that in the journalism handbook, or did you come up with that one yourself?" The laughter grew louder. The atmosphere had completely changed. What was supposed to be Steve Harvey defending himself had suddenly become Steve controlling the conversation. Sunny looked like she was trying not to laugh. Even Whoopi appeared entertained by what was unfolding. Joy, realizing she was losing control, tried to steer the discussion back. "Look, I'm simply pointing out that you've built a career giving advice about things you're not exactly an expert in." She continued without pausing. "Relationship advice from someone who's already failed at marriage twice. Life advice from someone who admits he barely finished high school. Don't you think people deserve better credentials from the people they choose as gurus?" That one hit differently. Steve's smile disappeared. His expression became serious. "Barely finished high school, Joy?" He paused. "I grew up in Cleveland in a working-class family. I didn't have fancy schools. I didn't have wealthy parents. And I certainly didn't have a perfect path laid out in front of me." He leaned closer to the table. "But you want to know what I did have?" The studio became quiet. "I had hunger. I had determination. And I had the willingness to fail over and over again until I finally succeeded." Steve let the words sit for a moment. Then his voice became even more serious. "You want to talk about credentials?" He pointed toward himself. "My credentials are sleeping in my car for 3 years while I tried to become a comedian. My credentials are performing in clubs where people laughed at me or sometimes didn't laugh at all. My credentials are being so broke that I had to decide whether I was going to eat or put gas in my car. The audience was completely silent. Those are my credentials, Joy. The School of Hard Knocks. He paused. And I promise you, that degree taught me things no classroom ever could. The audience exploded into applause. Steve had taken what was supposed to be an attack and turned it into one of the most powerful moments of the interview. But Joy wasn't finished. Her face had reddened slightly, yet she pushed forward. That's a lovely story, Steve. Very inspirational. But let's talk about something more recent. The Miss Universe incident. The room immediately became more tense. You announced the wrong winner on live television in front of millions of people. You humiliated that woman. And somehow, you managed to turn one of the biggest mistakes of your career into even more publicity. She leaned toward him. Don't you think there's something wrong with a culture that rewards incompetence? The mention of Miss Universe changed the atmosphere instantly. It was one of those moments Steve couldn't erase. A mistake witnessed by millions. A moment that could have destroyed another person's career. But Steve didn't become defensive. He smiled. Then he nodded. Joy, he said, I'm actually glad you brought that up. His tone was completely different now. That was one of the worst moments of my professional life. I made a mistake. A huge mistake. And hundreds of millions of people saw it. He paused. But you know what I did next? The studio fell silent. I apologized. I took responsibility. I didn't make excuses. I didn't blame somebody else. I didn't pretend it didn't happen. Steve looked directly across the table. I stood there in front of the world. And I owned my failure. For a moment, nobody said a word. Because Steve had just revealed the difference between making a mistake and being defined by one. Steve leaned forward, his eyes fixed on Joy. Let me ask you something. His voice was calm, but the room immediately felt different. When was the last time you apologized for something on this show? When was the last time you said something that turned out to be wrong, realized you'd hurt someone, and actually took responsibility for it? Nobody moved. Steve continued. Because I watch this show sometimes, and I hear plenty of opinions being thrown around. But what I don't hear very often is accountability when those opinions turn out to be wrong. The question landed hard. Joy opened her mouth, then stopped. For once, she didn't immediately have a response. The audience sat completely silent, sensing that the interview had crossed into something much more serious. Steve didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. The difference between you and me, Joy, is that I know I'm imperfect. He paused. I know I make mistakes. I know I'm going to get things wrong sometimes. And I'm not ashamed to admit it. Steve slowly shook his head. But sometimes I watch you sit at this table, and it feels like your opinions are presented as facts. Like your perspective is the only perspective that matters. And when someone disagrees with you, they're somehow less intelligent or less deserving of respect. He paused again. That isn't journalism. And honestly, it isn't even good conversation. His expression became more serious. That's ego wearing the costume of expertise. The studio went silent. And the saddest part? Steve continued. You've been doing it for so long that maybe you don't even recognize it anymore. The words seemed to hit Joy harder than anything he'd said before. Her confident posture shifted. She took a breath before finally responding. I think you're being oversensitive to legitimate criticism. Steve laughed. Not an angry laugh. A genuine laugh. Oversensitive? He looked at her almost as if he couldn't believe what he'd just heard. Joy, I just told you I slept in my car for 3 years. The audience became still again. I'd been heckled by drunk people in comedy clubs. I've been rejected. I've had doors slammed in my face. I've had people tell me I wasn't good enough. I've been told that a black man from Cleveland had no business becoming successful. He spread his hands. You think a few tough questions from you are going to make me sensitive? Steve smiled. Come on. His voice softened. I've been through too much to be shaken by somebody who thinks their opinion is the most important one in the room. The audience began to react. I've experienced real struggle. Real failure. Real rejection. And somehow, I'm still here. He nodded toward himself. Still smiling. Still working. Still succeeding. Then he looked directly at Joy. So, with all due respect, you're going to have to try a lot harder than that if you're trying to rattle me. The audience erupted. Applause filled the studio. Steve had somehow turned every attack into another reason to respect him, and he had done it without losing his humor or composure. Joy, meanwhile, looked increasingly uncomfortable. Sarah Haynes quickly tried to redirect the conversation. Maybe we should talk about Family Feud and the incredible run you've had with the show. Actually, Joy interrupted, I have one more question. The room quieted again. Steve looked over. Joy wasn't finished. Steve, you've spoken a lot over the years about your faith and about God's plan for your life. But you've also made comments that many people considered offensive. You've said atheists don't have a moral barometer. You've made statements about other religions that people considered intolerant. So how do you reconcile being a man of faith with making comments that some people see as intolerant? It sounded like the question Joy had been saving. The kind of question designed to end the conversation on her terms. But Steve didn't flinch. Joy, I'm a Christian. I believe what I believe. He paused. And yes, I've said things in the past that I've had to explain, clarify, or apologize for. His tone remained calm. Why? Because I'm human. I'm still learning. I'm still growing. Then Steve tilted his head slightly. But here's something I find interesting. He looked directly at Joy. You're questioning my tolerance while sitting at a table where you've also made comments about people of faith that many considered disrespectful. Joy's expression tightened. You've mocked Christians. You've dismissed religious people as backwards or ignorant. And you've made jokes about beliefs that millions of Americans consider sacred. Steve paused. So before you question me about intolerance, maybe take a look at the glass house you're standing in. He smiled faintly. Because from where I'm sitting, that glass looks pretty fragile. Joy's face reddened. That's not the same thing at all, she snapped. I question beliefs. I don't attack people. Steve nodded. Don't you? His voice was gentle. But the question was anything but. Because it certainly feels like an attack when you question someone's intelligence, their marriages, their education, their faith, and their entire career. He paused. All in the span of 10 minutes. The audience remained silent. It feels like an attack when you bring up the worst moment of someone's career simply to embarrass them. Another pause. And it feels like an attack when you suggest someone doesn't deserve their success because they didn't follow the path you believe they should have followed. Steve leaned back slightly. I came here to have a conversation. To promote something I'm proud of. To make people laugh. Maybe even make people think. He looked around the table. But you came in with a different agenda. Joy stared back at him. You wanted to tear me down. You wanted to prove you were smarter than me. More sophisticated than me. Better than me. Steve smiled. And here's the funny part. The studio became completely silent. In trying so hard to prove all of that. He paused. You may have actually proven the opposite. Joy stared at him. What exactly is that supposed to mean? She demanded. Her voice was noticeably unsteady. Steve's expression softened. Almost sympathetic. And somehow, That made his next words hit even harder. It means truly confident people don't need to tear other people down to feel powerful. He paused. It means truly intelligent people can disagree without being disrespectful. Another pause. And it means truly sophisticated people understand that basic respect doesn't disappear just because they disagree with their guest. Steve leaned back in his chair, completely relaxed. And for the first time that morning, Joy Behar looked like she wasn't sure what to say next. "You've spent this entire interview trying to make me look bad," Steve said, his voice still calm. "But here's the interesting part. You haven't made me look bad. You've simply shown everyone watching exactly how you behave when you think you're the one in control." He paused and looked directly at Joy. And honestly, Joy. A faint smile crossed his face. It's not a good look. Not at all. For a moment, the studio was silent. Then the audience erupted. Applause filled the room. People began standing. Some were cheering. Others were laughing in disbelief. Joy looked around the studio, and for the first time that morning, she seemed to realize something important. She had lost control. "This is ridiculous," Joy snapped, her voice rising. "The difference is, I answered with facts, experience, and a little humor." The audience laughed. "You came at me with condescension. I came back with confidence." He looked around the table. That's what happens when you spend your life having to earn people's respect instead of assuming you already deserve it. That was the moment Joy finally snapped. She pushed her chair backward and stood. The legs scraped loudly against the studio floor. "I don't have to sit here and be insulted by a game show host," she fired back. Steve didn't even raise his voice. "Actually, Joy." He paused. "That is exactly what you do for a living." The audience exploded. "You sit at this table and challenge people every day. You criticize them. You question them. You make jokes at their expense." Steve smiled. "The only difference today is that someone finally answered you back." He paused. "And apparently, you can dish it out. But you can't take it." The audience erupted again. The room was deafening. Joy stood frozen. Her face showed a mixture of anger, embarrassment, and disbelief. Then she turned. And without saying another word, she walked off the set. The audience gasped. Then the cheering became even louder. The remaining hosts sat in stunned silence. Nobody seemed quite sure what to say. Finally, Whoopi found her voice. "Well..." She looked around. "I think we need to take a commercial break." But Steve gently raised his hand. "Before we do that, Whoopi, I just want to say something." He turned toward the audience. The cameras moved in. And suddenly, the joking expression disappeared from his face. "I didn't come here to fight with anybody. I didn't come here to embarrass Joy. And I certainly didn't come here to prove that I'm better than anyone." He paused. "I came here to have a conversation." The studio became quiet. But when somebody comes at you with disrespect, you've got a choice. Steve looked directly into the camera. "You can sit there and take it. Or you can stand up for yourself." He nodded. "And you can do it without becoming the same kind of person you're standing up against." His voice softened. "I chose dignity." The audience applauded. "I've been blessed beyond anything I could have imagined. I went from having almost nothing to living a life I once could only dream about." He smiled. "And along the way, I learned something important. You teach people how to treat you. If you allow someone to constantly disrespect you, they'll keep doing it. But if you respect yourself enough to draw a line, people eventually learn where that line is." Steve smiled. "And the people who don't?" He paused. "Well, sometimes they walk off the set." The audience burst into warm laughter. Steve's famous smile returned. Now, Sarah. He turned toward Sarah Haynes. Didn't you want to ask me something about Family Feud? The audience laughed again. And somehow, Steve continued the interview as though nothing had happened. He talked about Family Feud. He talked about his family. He joked with the remaining hosts. He discussed his upcoming projects. And through it all, he remained exactly who he had been when he first walked into the studio. Confident. Funny. Relaxed. Unshaken. But everyone in that room knew they had witnessed something extraordinary. The interview had started with Joy believing she could put Steve Harvey on the defensive. Instead, the entire conversation had turned around. Not because Steve shouted louder. Not because he insulted her more viciously. But because he refused to let someone else's arrogance determine his own behavior. And as the cameras finally stopped rolling, the audience continued talking about what they had just witnessed. The moment wasn't really about winning an argument. It was about something much bigger. It was about confidence without cruelty. Standing up for yourself without losing your composure. And refusing to become the person attacking you. By the time the audience left the studio, one thing seemed certain. Steve Harvey hadn't walked into the interview looking for a confrontation. But when the confrontation came looking for him, he was ready. And the story didn't end when the cameras stopped. Clips of the confrontation spread across social media. Viewers debated the exchange. People replayed Steve's sharpest responses. Others focused on the moment Joy finally walked away. And one question kept coming up. What happens when someone who is used to controlling the conversation suddenly meets a person who refuses to be intimidated? Because sometimes, the most powerful response isn't shouting. It isn't anger. It isn't revenge. Sometimes, it's simply staying calm, standing your ground, and refusing to back down. And that may have been the biggest lesson Steve Harvey left behind that day. But perhaps the biggest impact wasn't what happened in the studio. It was what happened afterward. The confrontation sparked a much bigger conversation about how we treat people when we disagree with them and whether winning an argument is really worth humiliating the person on the other side. Steve showed that you can defend yourself without losing your dignity. You can stand your ground without becoming cruel. And sometimes, the most powerful way to answer an attack isn't with anger at all. It's with confidence, humor, and self-control. In a world where outrage gets attention and insults often get rewarded, Steve's response raised a completely different question. Do you really have to tear someone down to prove that you're right? But now I want to hear from you. Did Steve handle Joy perfectly? Or do you think he crossed the line? Tell me what you think in the comments below. And if you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like the video and subscribe for more unforgettable celebrity confrontations.